The first day I saw her, I did nothing. I want to be clear about that. Not because I am proud of it, because it is the truth, and I have spent enough years on this mountain learning that the truth does not soften itself to spare your feelings. It sits there like cold iron in your hand, and you either hold it or you drop it. I have always held it even when it burned. It was the 23rd of January, 1876, and the Absaroka Range was doing what it always does in the deep of winter. It was trying to kill everything that was not born from it. The wind came down off the northern ridges in long, low screams that bent the pine tops sideways and sent loose snow spiraling up into shapes that looked almost like men walking before they came apart. I had been on this mountain for 6 years. I knew its moods the way a man knows the face of someone he has stopped loving but cannot leave. Cold in the morning, colder at night. Occasionally a stillness so total it felt like the world had simply stopped breathing. I had been tracking a group of riders for 2 days before she appeared, 4 men, hired guns from the look of their horses and their gear. I had first picked up their trail near the lower meadow on the 21st, 2 sets of fresh prints cutting across the south-facing slope where no legitimate trapper or traveler had any reason to be in January. They were moving slow and deliberate, checking the old game trails, pausing at high points to look down into the valleys. They were not hunting elk. They were mapping something, or looking for something, or someone. I followed them from the eastern ridge, keeping to the leeward side of the rock faces, where the wind carried my scent away from their horses. 6 years alone on a mountain teaches a man to move without being seen. It also teaches him patience, because patience up here is not a virtue. It is the difference between coming home in the evening and not coming home at all. On the afternoon of the 23rd, the weather changed. A front came rolling in from the northwest, the kind that does not announce itself politely. The sky went from pale blue to the color of a bruise in under an hour, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees before I had finished descending from my observation point on the eastern ridge. I pulled my coat tighter and started back toward the tree line, intending to wait out whatever was coming. That was when I heard the shot. One shot, a rifle by the sound of it. Not close, maybe a quarter-mile south, muffled slightly by the trees, but sharp enough to cut through the rising wind. I stopped walking. I stood still for what was probably 30 seconds, which felt much longer, and then I heard something else. Not a second shot. Something softer, the sound of something moving through snow, fast and irregular, the lurching, desperate rhythm of a person running who is not sure they can keep running. I did not go toward the sound. I want you to understand why, because it matters. I had 4 armed men somewhere to my south, men who were clearly doing Harlan Dryden's work in an area they had no other reason to be in. If I moved toward the sound of that shot, I would be moving toward those men in worsening visibility on ground they had been studying for 2 days, with a storm coming in that would cut sight lines to almost nothing. A man alone does not win that kind of encounter. He just dies in an interesting location. So I went back to the cabin. I stoked the fire. I made coffee. I sat in the chair by the window with my rifle across my knees, and I listened to the storm come in and fill the world with white noise, and I thought about what I had heard, and I did not sleep. The second day I went back. The storm had passed by early morning and left behind that particular silence that only exists after heavy snowfall, a silence so complete it feels almost aggressive, as though the world is daring you to disturb it. I followed my own tracks back to the eastern ridge and then worked south along the tree line, moving carefully, checking the ground. I found the place where it had happened easily enough. The snow told the whole story plainly, without judgment and without omission. 4 sets of hoof prints converging from the west, a smaller set of boot prints, lighter, moving east. Then the boot prints breaking into a run, the stride lengthening and then losing its regularity, and there a dark stain already crusting over in the frozen air. Blood. Not a large amount, but enough. A wound that had been bleeding as she ran. Because by then I knew it was a woman. The boot prints were too small and too narrow for a man, and the way the stride changed when she started running told me she was carrying something on her left side, held close, something she was not willing to drop even as she ran for her life. I followed the trail for about 200 yards before I found her. She was under the low-hanging branches of a blue spruce in the hollow, where the tree's weight had compressed the snow into a rough shelter. She had crawled in there and pulled herself into the tightest shape she could manage, knees drawn up, arms crossed over her chest, and pressed against the trunk of the tree as if she was trying to become part of it. She was alive. I could see the faint movement of breath in the rise and fall of her shoulders, and when I crouched down and looked more carefully at her face, I could see the slight flutter of her eyelids, deep in whatever place the body goes when it is trying to survive by shutting everything down. Her coat was dark wool, good quality, once now ruined with mud and blood on the left side. She was young, 20, 22 at most. Her dark hair had frozen at the ends where sweat had dampened it, and the temperature had done the rest. Under her left arm, pressed against her body with a grip that had not loosened even in unconsciousness, she was holding a leather satchel. Tan leather reinforced at the corners and stamped on the front flap with 2 letters pressed deep into the hide. VV. I looked at those 2 letters for a long time. Long enough that the cold started working its way through my coat, and I had to consciously remind myself to keep breathing steadily. Victor Voss. The name landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward and outward, touching things I had worked very hard to keep undisturbed. Victor Voss had been a private investigator working out of Laramie. He had been, for a brief and significant period 6 years ago, the most important person in my professional life. He had uncovered evidence of a land fraud scheme of extraordinary scope, one that reached from the cattle barons of the Powder River Basin all the way up through the territorial government in Cheyenne. He had written up his findings in meticulous detail, and he had given them to me because I was then a deputy federal investigator, and because he trusted that I would do something with them. I had filed the report with my superior office. 3 weeks later, Victor Voss was dead. Officially, he had been killed during an attempted robbery. The evidence he had gathered had never been formally reviewed. And 1 week after Victor Voss died, my wife Ruth was killed in what was described as a tragic accident, a runaway carriage on a street in Cheyenne that she had walked down safely 100 times before. I had known with a certainty that lived below the level of proof that neither death was accidental. I had known who was responsible, and I had not been able to prove it. And I had run. I had come up to the Absaroka, and I had built a cabin, and I had learned to trap, and I had let 6 years pass over me like water over a stone, smoothing everything down until it was mostly numb. Mostly. The girl under the tree was breathing in shallow, uneven pulls. She was in the early stages of hypothermia, and the wound in her left side had bled enough to soak through her coat and freeze there, which had actually slowed the bleeding in a grim, practical way. The 4 men who had shot her were somewhere south of here, and I did not know if they had given up the search or if they were waiting out the storm and intended to resume it. I stood over her for a long time. Then I turned and walked back to my cabin. On the 3rd day, the 4 riders had gone. I checked their tracks at first light, and they led south and did not come back. Whether they believed she was dead, or whether they had simply given up, or whether they had other orders, I did not know. What I knew was that if she was still alive in that hollow under the blue spruce, she would not be by nightfall. I went and got her. She weighed less than I expected when I lifted her. People in bad shape often do as though the body starts economizing early, shedding everything it does not absolutely need. I carried her back to the cabin with her held across my arms, her head against my shoulder, the satchel still locked under her arm, because even unconscious she would not let go of it. I had almost reached the cabin door when something fell from inside her coat. It landed in the snow at my feet, face up, and I stopped walking. It was a wanted notice, printed on thick paper, the kind the Federal Marshal's Office used. At the top, in heavy block letters, "Wanted for murder." And below that a name I recognized because it was my own. Elias Rourke, wanted for the murder of Victor Voss. March 1870. Reward $400. I stood in the snow outside my own cabin, holding an unconscious woman who had been shot and nearly frozen to death, and I read my own name on a wanted poster that she had been carrying in the lining of her coat. I looked at her face for a moment. Then I looked back at the paper. Then I carried her inside and kicked the door shut behind me. I set her down on the furs near the hearth and got the fire built up, and I did not allow myself to think about the wanted poster until she was warm enough that her color started coming back and her breathing evened out into something less desperate. I had field-dressed enough wounds in enough difficult circumstances to know what needed doing, and I did what needed doing efficiently and without sentiment. The wound along her left side was a graze serious but not fatal if it was properly cleaned and bound. The hypothermia was the more immediate danger. I worked on both. When I was satisfied that she was stable, I sat down at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I took the wanted poster out of my coat pocket and laid it flat on the table in front of me. Harlan Dryden. It had to be. Dryden was the name that stood behind everything that had happened 6 years ago. He was the architect of the land scheme that Victor Voss had uncovered. He was the reason Victor Voss was dead. I was almost certain, the reason Ruth was dead. And now apparently he had also arranged for me to be named as Victor Voss's killer, which served two purposes simultaneously. It removed any credibility I might have as a witness, and it meant that any lawman in the territory had legal authority to shoot me on sight. 6 years I had been up on this mountain, and Dryden had apparently spent some of that time making sure that if I ever came down, I would hang. I folded the wanted poster and put it back in my pocket. Then I looked at the girl lying on my furs, her chest rising and falling in the firelight, her dark hair beginning to dry. She was Victor Voss's daughter. She had to be. The satchel, the initials, the fact that Dryden's men had shot her. And she was carrying a wanted poster with my name on it, which meant she knew who I was and had been looking for me, or had at least expected to encounter me, which opened up a set of questions I did not yet have answers to. I drank the cold coffee. Outside the wind was picking up again, but gently this time, the ordinary late January wind rather than the punishing kind. The fire crackled. The girl breathed. I had done nothing on the first day. That was true. But I had come back on the second day and looked at her, and that had cost me something, because looking means acknowledging, and acknowledging means you are no longer free to simply walk away. I knew that about myself. I had always known it. It was the same impulse that had made me file Victor Voss's report 6 years ago, instead of doing the sensible thing and pretending I had never received it. The impulse had cost me everything I had at the time. I was up here on this mountain with almost nothing left, which meant perhaps that it could not cost me very much more. I got up and added another log to the fire. She burned for 3 days. The fever came in hard on the first night, the body's response to cold and blood loss, and whatever it had been through before the cold and the blood loss. I kept the fire steady, and I kept water heated, and I managed the fever, the way you manage any dangerous thing up here, with patience and attention, and the understanding that you cannot force it, you can only create the conditions for it to resolve itself. She was not quiet during the fever. She spoke in fragments the half-language of high delirium, and I will not pretend that I did not listen. What she said was mostly disconnected names and places that meant nothing to me. Snatches of argument, once a long sequence that sounded like instructions for something, the words tumbling over each other without coherence. But twice, clearly enough that I was certain I had not imagined it, she said the name Harlan Dryden, and once in a different register, entirely quieter and more deliberate than anything else she said. In those 3 days, she said, "Find Rourke." Papa said, "Find Rourke." I was sitting at the table cleaning my rifle when she said that. I set the cloth down, and I sat very still for a moment. Then I picked the cloth back up and kept cleaning. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. I knew it before she was fully conscious because her breathing changed. The tight, labored quality left it replaced by something slower and more natural. By the time the light through the small east-facing window had brightened enough to be worth calling morning, she had opened her eyes. I was in my chair by the table. I did not look up immediately. I gave her a moment to find herself, to take in the ceiling and the walls and the fire, and work through the process of understanding where she was and that she was not dead. It takes time, that process. I know from experience. When I heard her try to sit up and the sharp intake of breath that followed, I said, without looking up from what I was doing, that she should move slowly and that there was water in the tin cup on the floor beside her. Silence. then the soft sound of her reaching for the cup. She drank. I continued what I was doing, which was nothing in particular, just the kind of occupied hands business that fills time in a one-room cabin in winter. Then she said, "You are Elias Rourke." Not a question. A statement delivered in a voice still rough from disuse but level, controlled. The voice of someone who had decided before she opened her eyes what the first thing she was going to say would be. I set down what I was holding. I looked at her for the first time since she had been conscious enough to look back. She had pulled herself up against the log wall, the fur blanket drawn up to her chest, and she was watching me with dark eyes that were clear and direct despite everything her body had recently been through. She was pale, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of more exhaustion than 4 days of fever could account for. But her jaw was set and her gaze was steady, and I understood immediately that whatever she had survived before my finding her had not been her first time having to survive something. "You know who I am," I said. "My father mentioned you." She paused, the effort of speaking visible but controlled. "You were a federal investigator. He gave you his report." I filed the report with my superior office. "And my father died 3 weeks after that." I did not respond to that. There was nothing to say to it that would have meant anything. It was true. I had filed the report, and Victor Voss had died, and I had run, and no arrangement of words was going to change the shape of those facts. She watched me for a moment as though measuring the silence. I stood and poured coffee from the pot on the stove. I walked to where she was sitting and set the cup on the floor in front of her. Not in her hand. On the floor within easy reach. I went back to my chair. She looked at the cup. Then she looked at me. Whatever she had expected from this encounter, this apparently was not it. "The satchel," she said. "On the table. I did not open it." She looked at the table. The satchel was there where I had set it when I brought her in. She looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at something you have been protecting for a very long time and are still not certain is safe. Then she reached for the coffee cup and she drank, and the cup trembled slightly in her hands. She set it down and looked at me with an expression that had a question in it. "How long have I been here?" 4 days. A slow breath. Processing. "They will think I am dead," she said, not unhappy about this, filing it as useful information. "Probably. The men who shot you pulled out on the 2nd day. No tracks coming back." She nodded slowly. Then she reached down, moving carefully to protect her side, and she picked up the satchel. She opened it. She looked inside, and some of the tension in her shoulders released fractionally in the way that tension releases when you confirm something you were afraid might not be true. She reached in and drew out a small book, dark green cover, no larger than a man's palm. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up at me. "My father kept this for 4 years, she said. "Everything he found. Names, dates, amounts, descriptions of what was paid for." She set it on her knee. "There is enough in here to put Harlan Dryden in front of a federal judge." She opened it to the first page and held it out toward me, not handing it to me, showing it the way you show evidence rather than offering a gift. I got up and came close enough to read it. The first page was a list. Names in the left column, dates in the middle, dollar amounts on the right. The handwriting was small and precise, the writing of someone who had spent a great deal of time making documents that needed to hold up to scrutiny. I read down the list slowly. Territorial officials, mostly. A judge. A man I recognized as a senior partner in one of the largest cattle operations in the basin, and then about 2/3 of the way down a name that stopped me. I read it twice to make sure. Ruth Rourke. March 14, 1870. Purpose: elimination of investigative liability. I stepped back. I turned away from her and walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered clearing in front of the cabin, which told me nothing and asked nothing of me, and was in that moment exactly what I needed. My wife's death had been ordered, planned, paid for. It had a line in a ledger, a date, a purpose described in the cold language of accounting. Elimination of investigative liability. Ruth, who laughed before she said anything difficult to make it easier to hear, who had pressed wildflowers between the pages of books she loved, who had walked down that street in Cheyenne 100 times, and had never known she was a liability to anyone. I stood at the window for a long time. When I turned back, Clara Voss had not looked away from me. She was watching with an expression I could not fully categorize. Not pity. Something more careful than that. Something that understood that certain silences need to be allowed to exist without someone rushing in to fill them. "You knew that was in there," I said. "Yes." "Before you came up here. You had read the notebook." "Yes." I came back to my chair and sat down. "Then you knew what you were coming to find." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "My father left instructions. If something happened to him, I was to take the notebook and bring it to a federal judge, not a territorial judge, a federal appointment, someone outside the local structure. He gave me a name, Arthur Crane, recently appointed in Cheyenne." She paused. "He also told me that if I got into trouble on the way, there was a man in the Absaroka range who had reason to help. He said the man's name was Elias Rourke, and that I should find him. Your father knew I was up here. He knew someone matching your description had been living in the Absaroka for several years. He believed it was you. He said you were the one person he had trusted who had not failed him by intention." Her voice stayed level, but something in the last phrase cost her something. He was careful about the distinction. Failed him not by intention, meaning I had failed him by weakness or by slowness or by not fighting hard enough when it mattered, but not because I had wanted to. I did not know if that was a consolation or not. It did not feel like one. "The wanted poster you were carrying," I said, "with my name on it." She did not look away. "I knew about the charges. I was not sure whether they were real or manufactured. And now I am sitting in your cabin drinking your coffee 4 days after you found me in the snow, and you have not done anything to collect $400. She looked at me steadily. "I think I know which it is." I got up and refilled her coffee cup from the pot. I did not say anything because there was not anything useful to say, and because I was thinking about something else. I was thinking about the last page of her father's notebook, which she had not shown me, and which I had not mentioned. I had seen the corner of a different page near the back, the handwriting more hurried than the rest, pressed in with more urgency. She had closed the notebook before I got a clear look at it. Whatever was on that page, she had decided not to show it to me yet. I put the pot back on the stove. Outside the window, a pair of jays were fighting over something in the spruce tree at the edge of the clearing, their argument carrying sharp and clear in the cold air. Ordinary world continuing its ordinary business. "Your side needs to be checked," I said, "and you need to eat something that is not broth. I can help cook if you show me where things are. You can sit there and not tear open the wound you have been trying to ignore since you sat up." She looked at me for a moment with an expression that suggested she was considering an argument. Then she settled back against the wall and pulled the blanket up. "Mr. Rourke," she said. "Elias." "Elias." She looked at her father's notebook still on her knee. "How long do you think we have before they send someone else up the mountain?" I thought about the 4 riders. I thought about what I knew of Harlan Dryden, which was considerable, and about what I knew of how men like him operated when something they wanted had not been recovered. I thought about the spring thaw, which was still several weeks away, and which would make the upper trails passable for larger groups. Before the thaw. Probably one man if Dryden is impatient, someone who knows winter travel at elevation. I paused. After the thaw, I would expect more. She absorbed this without visible alarm. Whatever fear she had been carrying up the mountain with her, she had already made her accounting with it. What was left in her face was something past fear, something that had considered the worst likely outcomes and decided to keep moving anyway. "Then we do not have much time," she said. "No," I said, "we do not." I put a pan on the stove and started cutting salt pork into it, and the cabin filled with the sound of it and the smell of it, and I thought about Victor Voss writing his daughter's name into instructions he wrote in case he did not survive, about Ruth's name in a ledger under the heading of things to be eliminated, about a wanted poster with my name on it that had been manufactured out of nothing by a man who had apparently spent 6 years making sure that if I ever came down from this mountain, I would come down into a noose. I thought about all of these things, and I cooked the salt pork, and I did not say any of them out loud because there would be time for that later. And right now, what was needed was food and warmth and the basic maintenance of staying alive for another day. That has always been where it starts. Another day. And then another. I put a pan on the stove and started cutting salt pork. The fire crackled behind me. I thought about all of it, and I did not say any of it out loud, because there would be time for that later, and right now what was needed was food and warmth and the basic maintenance of staying alive for another day. That has always been where it starts. Another day. And then another. The first thing I taught her was how to stand, not how to aim, not how to pull a trigger, not any of the things people imagine when they think about being taught to shoot. Before any of that, there is the matter of standing, because everything else comes from the ground up, from the way your weight is distributed and your balance is held and your body is oriented to the thing you are facing. Get the foundation wrong, and it does not matter how good your eyes are or how steady your hands are. You will miss, or worse, you will flinch, and flinching in the wrong moment has consequences that cannot be undone. She had been on her feet for 4 days before I took her outside, long enough that the wound in her side had closed properly, and the bruising had moved through its worst colors and was beginning to fade at the edges. She was still moving carefully, protecting her left side instinctively, but she was moving, and she was not complaining about it, and she had not asked me once when she could get up and leave. That last thing told me something about her. People in a hurry ask that question. People who understand the situation do not. The morning I decided to start was clear and cold, the sky a hard, flat blue that you only get at elevation in late January, a blue that looks painted on. I handed her the Colt I kept as a secondary weapon unloaded, and I told her to hold it. She took it with her right hand, and I watched how she did it. What her instincts were, what 6 years of having no one teach her correctly had built in her by default. She gripped it too tight, too high on the handle. Her wrist was already beginning to compensate for the weight by canting slightly inward. Her feet were close together, her weight back on her heels. I did not say any of this immediately. "How does it feel?" I asked. "Heavy," she said, "and off balance." "That is because you are off balance. Spread your feet, shoulder width. Put your weight forward, not back. You want to be leaning into it, not away from it." She adjusted. "Better. Now hold it up, eye level. Do not lock your elbow." She raised the gun. Her arm trembled slightly with the unaccustomed weight. She set her jaw and held it steady through the effort of will. "You are gripping too hard," I said. "A gun is not going anywhere. You do not need to strangle it. Firm, not tight. There is a difference." "How do I know if I have it right?" "Your knuckles are white. That is how you know you do not." She loosened her grip by degrees. Her knuckles came back to their normal color. We did this for an hour. Just holding the gun, adjusting, holding, lowering, raising again. At the end of the hour, her arm was shaking with fatigue and she had not fired a single round. She did not complain about that either. What I noticed over the days that followed was that she did not ask questions in the way most people do. Most people who are learning something ask questions to demonstrate their interest or to fill silence, or because they are anxious and asking questions gives them something to do with their anxiety. Clara asked questions only when she did not understand something, and when I answered, she did not ask a follow-up unless the answer raised a genuine problem. She listened with the focused stillness of someone who understood that the information mattered. On the 5th day of training, during a pause while she was resting her arm, she looked at me and said, "You were a federal investigator for how long?" 8 years. "And before that?" "Before that, I did other things." She accepted this without pressing it. A moment passed. The cold was settling in harder as the afternoon wore on our breath, making small clouds between us. "Did you like it?" "The work." I thought about that. It was not a question I had asked myself in a long time. "I liked finding things out," I said eventually. "I liked the part where something that was hidden became visible. The part after that, the part where you take what you have found and give it to people who are supposed to do something with it, that part I liked less. Because they did not always do something with it. because they sometimes did something with it that was worse than if you had found nothing." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that what happened with my father's report? I filed it with my superior. He told me it was being reviewed. 3 weeks later your father was dead, and I was told the investigation had been closed for lack of actionable evidence." "And you believed that?" "No," I said. "I did not believe it, but I could not prove otherwise, and the people I would have needed to take it to were the same people who had just closed it." She turned the Colt over in her hands, looking at it. "So you came up here?" "So I came up here." She raised the gun again, checked her stance, adjusted her feet by an inch. "My father knew you were up here," she said. "I told you that. But I did not tell you how he knew. He had been looking for you for about a year before he died. He told me once that he felt you were the only person involved who had tried to do the right thing, and that the fact that you had disappeared meant you were either dead or hiding, and that if you were hiding you had a reason, and that the reason was probably that you had figured out the same thing he had. Which was that the problem was not just Harlan Dryden, that Dryden had people inside the federal structure, that filing reports and going through proper channels was not going to work because the channels had been redirected." I looked at her. "Your father was a careful thinker." "He was," she said. Her voice changed when she said it. Not much, but enough that I noticed and did not press further, and then she raised the gun to eye level and held it there, and did not say anything else for a while. That evening was the first time she mentioned Jude Callaway. We were inside after dark, the fire doing its steady work. I had made a stew with dried venison and what root vegetables I had left in the cold storage, and she had eaten more than I expected, which was a good sign. I was cleaning my rifle at the table, and she was sitting near the fire mending a tear in the sleeve of her coat with thread and a needle from my kit, working with the practiced ease of someone who has mended a great many things. "Before I came up the mountain," she said, not looking up from the mending, "I stopped in a town called Ridgecroft to buy supplies. There was a man at the general store. He recognized me, or he recognized my name when the storekeeper said it. He said he knew a man who had been asking about Harlan Dryden, someone who was trying to find an angle on him for reasons of his own. He said the man's name was Jude Callaway, and that he did contract work, but was not a bad man, just a man in a difficult spot." "Did you speak to Callaway?" "No, I did not have time, and I did not know if it was safe, but I remembered the name." I kept cleaning the rifle. "Jude Callaway," I said mostly to myself. "You know him?" I did know him. Jude Callaway and I had served together briefly during the war in the same unit for about 8 months before reassignment separated us. I had not seen him since. I knew he had drifted into bounty work after the war, which was not unusual for men who had certain skills and found the peacetime economy uninterested in them. I had not thought about him in years. "We served together," I said, "a long time ago. He is a capable man, not dishonest, or he was not when I knew him, but bounty work changes people." "If Dryden has posted a reward," she said, "Callaway might come looking for me." Or for me. "The poster you were carrying, that reward is real. $400 is real money." She glanced up from the mending. "Are you worried about him?" "I am thinking about him." "Those are different things." She went back to the mending. I finished with the rifle and began to reassemble it. "There is something else," she said. Her voice had changed. Not much. Enough for me to notice. I set down the rifle barrel and waited. She finished the stitch she was on and tied it off and set the coat aside. She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she looked at me. "I told you my father kept the notebook for 4 years. That is true, but there is a page near the back that I did not show you. I was not sure when I was sitting there with you on the second day whether I was ready to." I did not say anything. I had noticed the unshown page. I had decided not to raise it until she did. "My father was honest," she said. "He was fundamentally, genuinely honest, and the work he did in those 4 years, the risk he took, was the act of an honest man trying to correct something wrong. I believe that completely." She paused. "But in the first year, before he understood the full scope of what Dryden was doing, before he understood who he was really dealing with, he accepted money from Dryden. 1 payment, $500 to look the other way on a property transfer that he had flagged in his official capacity. He convinced himself it was minor, that the transfer was not as problematic as he had thought. He told himself what people tell themselves when they want to do something they know they should not do. The fire moved between us. He regretted it within a month, she continued. He returned the money which Dryden refused to accept, and he started keeping the notebook. He started documenting everything, including his own initial acceptance of that payment, because he decided that if he was going to expose Dryden, he was going to do it honestly, and doing it honestly meant not hiding the parts where he himself had been less than what he should have been. She reached into the satchel and took out the notebook. She turned to the last page and held it out to me. The last page was different from the others. The handwriting was the same, but the lines were more widely spaced, more deliberate, each word placed with care. It was a short entry. Victor Voss, writing to a reader he knew might be a judge, or might be his daughter, or might be some combination of circumstances he could not predict. He wrote that he had accepted a payment, named the amount, named the date. He wrote that he had returned it. He wrote that he had subsequently spent 4 years compiling evidence that he hoped would serve as something more useful than an apology. And then, at the bottom of the page in handwriting that pressed harder into the paper than the rest, he wrote, "I have tried to be the man my daughter believes I am. I do not know if I have managed it, but I have tried." I read it twice. Then I closed the notebook and set it on the table. Clara was watching me. She had the look of someone who has just put something very heavy down and is not sure if it was the right place to put it. "He was honest," I said. "A man who was not honest would not have written that page." "I know," she said, "but it is complicated." "Most things are." I paused. "Why are you telling me this now?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, with the careful precision of someone who has thought about how to say something for a long time, "Because you told me that you knew about the charges against you and stayed up on this mountain for 6 years. Because you have been sitting across from me in this cabin for nearly 2 weeks, and you have not once tried to make me feel sorry for you, or tried to justify yourself." She looked at me steadily. "Because I think you are someone who can hear that my father was not perfect and not use it against him or against me. And because I did not want to go any further into this without you knowing the whole truth." I sat with that for a moment. "The notebook with that page in it is still the evidence we need," I said. "One $500 payment that was returned does not change what Dryden did. It does not appear in the columns for his benefit. Your father documented it himself. A federal judge will see what it is. Will a federal judge trust it? Will he say that Victor Voss had a personal reason to go after Dryden, that the evidence was tainted at the source? Not if it is corroborated, which it will be." I picked up the notebook and handed it back to her. "The notebook is one piece. We need other pieces, which is what we are going to spend the next several days working out." She took the notebook and held it on her lap for a moment. "There is one more thing," she said. "On the mountain before I found the trail that led toward your cabin, the men who shot me, they were not just looking for me. I heard them talking before they found me. One of them said they had orders to find the cabin too, that Dryden knew someone was living up here and wanted to know if it was who he thought it was." "He has known I was up here for some time," I said. "I expect. A man like Dryden does not let loose ends lie forever." "Then we are both being hunted." "We have been being hunted," I said. "The difference is that now we know it clearly, and knowing a thing clearly is always better than not knowing it." She looked at me for a moment with an expression I was coming to recognize, a kind of measuring look, assessing whether what I had just said was true or whether I was simply trying to make her feel steadier. Apparently she decided it was true, because she nodded once, picked up her coat, and went back to checking whether the mending would hold. 2 days later, Jude Callaway knocked on my door. He came in the early afternoon in plain sight, his horse walking at a normal pace up the trail from the south, his hands visible, the rifle on his saddle scabbard, but not in his hands. He stopped his horse 40 yards from the cabin and called my name once clearly without theatrics. He sat in the saddle and waited. I watched him from the window for about 30 seconds, reading everything I could read. He was heavier than I remembered, broader in the shoulders, with a beard he had not had during the war. His tack was serviceable and well maintained. His horse was a good animal, calm and well fed. He was not acting like a man who expected to be shot at, which meant either he was very confident or very foolish, and Jude Callaway had never been foolish. Clara was standing to my right, far enough from the window to be out of the sight line. "Is that him?" she asked. "That is him." I went to the door and opened it and stepped out onto the snow in front of the cabin. I did not have my rifle. I had the Colt on my hip, but I kept my hand away from it. Jude looked down at me from his horse. 6 years since I had seen him, and the 6 years showed, but underneath them the essential thing was the same, the quality of a man who has seen a great deal and has found a way to continue working in spite of it. "Elias," he said. "Jude, you look like a trapper." "I am a trapper." "You look like a man who has not talked to another person in a while." "I am that too." I looked at him evenly. "What are you doing on my mountain, Jude?" He swung down from his horse without hurry, looped the reins around the post by the water trough, turned and looked at me with his hands hanging open at his sides, the posture of a man who wants to be clearly readable. "Dryden has a reward posted for Clara Voss," he said. $800 for the girl, another $200 if the satchel comes with her." "I know. I was in Ridgecroft when the notice came through. I took the job." I waited. "I am telling you I took the job," Jude said, "because I want you to know that I came up here with my eyes open. I am not pretending I am here for another reason." He looked at me steadily. "But before I got to Ridgecroft, I was in Sweetwater, and in Sweetwater I heard something that I have been thinking about ever since, and it is the reason I am standing in front of you instead of waiting at the bottom of the mountain with a rope." "Say it." "Dryden took a mortgage on my father's land 2 years ago. Except that my father never signed that mortgage. The signature on the document is my father's name, but it is not my father's hand. Patrick Callaway has not signed his own name the same way twice in his life, but even so, the signature on Dryden's document does not resemble his at all, not even close, and when my father tried to contest it through the county recorder's office, the clerk told him the document was valid, and the conversation was over." He paused. "My father has been on that land for 31 years. He built the house himself. If Dryden calls the mortgage in this summer, my father loses everything he has." The afternoon was very quiet. A breeze moved through the pine tops. "If Dryden is convicted of fraud on a federal level," I said, "every contract he has forced through under fraudulent conditions is invalidated, including mortgages on land he had no legitimate claim to." Jude looked at me for a long moment. The tiredness in his face did not leave, but underneath it something else appeared briefly like ground, showing through snow. Not surprise exactly, more like a man who has been carrying weight for a long time and has just been told he can set it down, but is not entirely sure he believes it yet. "That is the law," he said. "That is the law." He stood in the snow outside my cabin for another moment. Then he turned, unhitched his horse from the post, and led it around toward the small lean-to shelter at the side of the cabin where I kept my own horse in bad weather. "You have room in there for another one?" he asked. "I do." "Then I will get him settled and come in, and you can tell me what you are planning." I went inside. Clara was standing near the table watching me come back in. She had heard most of it through the door, which was thin enough that sound carried through it without much effort. "He is going to help," she said. It was not quite a question. "He is going to help." She sat down slowly, carefully protecting her side. She looked at the table at the notebook lying there. Then she looked up at me. "We need 3 things," she said. "We need to get the evidence to someone who can act on it. We need to make sure Dryden cannot use a hostage to stop us. And we need someone inside his operation who is willing to talk." I had been thinking the same 3 things for several days. It was not surprising that she had arrived at the same conclusions. The structure of the problem was not complicated, only the execution of it was. "There is a federal judge in Cheyenne," I said. "Arthur Crane, appointed from Washington 4 months ago. He has no established relationships in the territory, yet no one has had time to get to him." That is where we take the notebook. That is where we take the notebook. Getting there is the question. What about the hostage problem? This was the part I had been sitting with most uneasily, because I already knew what the hostage problem was, and it had a specific face and a specific name and a specific age. There is a marshal in this county named Colt Feeney, I said. He has a daughter, 8 years old, sick with a lung condition. Dryden has been paying for her medical care. About 3 weeks ago, from what I have been able to gather from what you told me about the men who were following you, Dryden replaced the girl's doctor with his own man. Clara looked at me. He turned the child into a lever. He turned the child into a lever, I said, which means that Feeney, who signed whatever Dryden needed him to sign and looked away from whatever Dryden needed him to look away from, is now past the point where his own safety is enough motivation to keep him compliant. Dryden has moved on to the child. A man who can be pushed that far will eventually push back. That is what I am counting on. I paused. I saw Feeney 2 days before the storm that caught you on the mountain. He was on the southern approach to this ridge alone, no deputies. He stopped at the overlook point and stood there for about 10 minutes looking down in this direction. Then he turned around and left. He was checking if you were really here, or he was trying to decide something. A man on his own, out of uniform, standing on a ridge for 10 minutes in January is not doing routine patrol work. She was quiet for a moment. You think he wants to talk? I think he is trying to decide if he can afford to. There is a difference. We need to tip that balance. Jude came in from outside, stamping snow off his boots, and hung his coat on the peg by the door. He looked around the cabin with the assessing eyes of a man who has slept in enough different places to quickly categorize them. Then he looked at Clara Voss with an expression that was direct without being aggressive. You are Victor Voss's daughter, he said. Clara, she said. Yes. I am sorry about your father, he said. I did not know him, but what I have heard about him since this business began suggests he was a man of more courage than most. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, she said quietly, and the compression was back in her voice, that careful management of something that had not been fully allowed to come out yet. Jude pulled out a chair and sat down. He looked at me. Tell me what you are thinking. I told him. He listened without interrupting the way he had always listened, absorbing the information and turning it over. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Feeney, you think he can be reached? I think he wants to be reached and does not know how to make the first move. Then we make it for him. Jude folded his hands on the table. I can get word to him. I still have contacts in Ridgecroft, and Ridgecroft is his usual stop on the Eastern Circuit. I can arrange to be there when he comes through, and I can tell him where to be and when without it looking like anything that would raise a flag with Dryden's people. You would be exposing yourself. I am already exposed. I took the job and then I rode up the mountain and I have not come back down with anything. Dryden's people are going to notice that eventually. He looked at me without apology. I would rather be exposed on the front end of this and doing something useful than exposed on the back end and standing in the wrong place. Clara had been following this exchange in silence. Now she said, when you speak to Feeney, what do you tell him? Jude looked at her. I tell him that there is a path out of this that saves his daughter and costs him something significant but not everything. And I tell him that the window on that path is not going to be open very long. She considered this. And if he goes directly to Dryden with it, then we have a different problem, Jude said simply. But I do not think he will. A man who has been standing on a ridge in January by himself, looking at where he is not supposed to go, is a man who is already thinking about doors. We are not offering him a door he does not want. We are just telling him it is there. The fire had burned down some while we talked. I put another log on it and stood for a moment watching it catch. Through the window the light was going the short winter afternoon, collapsing into blue dusk, the snow on the clearing turning from white to gray. I thought about Victor Voss standing on a ridge of a different kind the moment he had decided to start the notebook to write down the first name and the first date and the first dollar amount, knowing as he did it that there was no clean way back from that decision. I thought about him writing the last page, putting down in careful, deliberate handwriting The part of the story that made him look less than what he wanted to be because he had decided that the whole truth was more important than a clean version of himself. I thought about what it takes to do that, to hold the whole of something and present it honestly when an edited version would have been easier and would have served you better in almost every practical sense. He had tried to be the man his daughter believed he was. He had written it himself. Looking at Clara Voss sitting at my table in the firelight, the green notebook in her hands, her jaw set and her eyes clear, I thought that he had probably managed it more completely than he had known. 3 days after Jude arrived, he rode back down to Ridgecroft. He was gone for 2 days, and I did not sleep well either night. Not from worry about Jude specifically, who was capable enough to manage himself in difficult terrain, but from the particular restlessness that comes from waiting for the first move to be made in something that cannot be unmade. You load a gun, and you point it, and you decide to pull the trigger, and from that point forward, a sequence of events is in motion that your wanting or not wanting has no further influence over. We had loaded the gun. Jude riding down the mountain was the trigger. Clara and I continued the training. In the mornings we went out to the clearing and worked with the Colt and with the Winchester. I kept on the rack above the door, and in the afternoons she read through the notebook again, making her own notes on a pad of paper. I gave her organizing the information in a way that would present cleanly to a judge. She worked with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who understands that thoroughness now saves time later. I watched her do it and thought that she would have been good at investigative work with that mind. On the morning of the second day, without Jude, during a pause in the shooting practice, she asked me something I was not expecting. "The night I was feverish," she said. "Did I say anything?" I considered how to answer that. "Fragments," I said. "Nothing coherent. You said your father's name a few times." "Did I say anything else?" "You said find Rourke. Papa said find Rourke." She looked out across the clearing. The snow was brilliant in the morning light, almost painful to look at directly. She was quiet for long enough that I thought she had decided to leave it there. Then she said, "He made me promise. Before he died, or before I knew he was going to die about 2 months before. He sat me down one evening and he told me about the notebook, and he told me about you, and he told me what to do if something happened. He made me go through it 3 times until I had it exactly right." She paused. He was calm when he said it, not frightened, just very organized and clear about it, as though he was going through a checklist for a trip, as though it was practical and not terrible. "He was protecting you," I said. "Making it practical was how he protected you from how frightened he was." She turned and looked at me. The expression on her face was something I had not seen there before, something that had come loose from wherever she kept it managed. "Yes," she said. "I know that. I knew it then, too." She turned back to the clearing. "I was not able to tell him I knew it. I did not want to make him have to talk about how frightened he was when he was working so hard to be practical. So I just went through the checklist with him 3 times, and I did not say anything about the other part of it." The wind moved through the pines at the clearing's edge, a slow sound like breathing. "He knew you knew," I said. "People usually do." She was quiet for another moment. Then she raised the Colt, checked her stance without being told to, and fired at the knot on the pine post 30 yards out. She hit it not dead center, but close enough. She levered the next round and fired again, closer. I did not say anything. I just watched her shoot. Jude came back on the afternoon of the 3rd day, his horse moving at a pace that said he had news but not emergency. He came inside and accepted coffee and sat down and told us what had happened. He had found Feeney in Ridgecroft at the relay station where the Eastern Circuit riders stopped to change horses. He had approached him in a way that looked to anyone watching like 2 men who knew each other passing a few minutes in conversation. He had said 4 things to Feeney. He had said that the path Feeney had been looking at from the ridge was real. He had said that it required Feeney to bring something with him, specifically any documentation he had held back from Dryden as personal security. He had said that Lily would not be left without protection during the process. And he had said that the window was 3 weeks. "How did he respond?" Clara asked. "He listened," Jude said. "He did not say much. He asked one question, which was, he asked if Elias Rourke was actually on the mountain or if it was a story people told. "What did you say?" I asked. "I said you were real, you were ornery, and you had better coffee than anyone else in the Absaroka range." He looked at me over his cup. He said he would think about it. "A man who says he will think about it has already started," Clara said. Jude looked at her with an expression that revised his estimate of her upward. "That is exactly right," he said. He came 4 days later, not to the cabin. We had arranged a meeting place through Jude's contact, a relay station on the old freight road that had been closed since a rock slide 2 winters back close enough to the mountain that Feeney could explain the direction of his travel as a circuit inspection far enough from the cabin that if he had brought anyone with him, we would see them before they saw us. He had not brought anyone with him. I was there when he arrived. Jude was positioned at the ridge above with the long rifle, which Feeney did not know and did not need to know. Clara was at the relay station itself inside where I had put her because I needed her there and because she was at this point in her recovery accurate enough to matter if it came to that. It had not come to that. Feeney came in from the south alone, and he tied his horse, and he came into the relay station with his hat in his hand, which struck me as something a man does when he is somewhere he has no authority and knows it. He was not what I had imagined. I had built a picture of him from facts and context, and the picture was of someone harder than the man standing in front of me. He was in his mid-40s with the kind of face that has been weathered without being toughened, a face that still showed what happened to it. He looked tired in a way that went beyond the physical tired, in the bone tired, in the way of a man who has not slept an honest night in a long time. He looked at me. He looked at Clara, who was standing by the wall with the notebook in her hands. He looked at the notebook for a moment with the expression of a man recognizing something he was not sure he wanted to recognize. Then he sat down on the bench along the wall without being asked, and he turned his hat in his hands and he said, "I need to know that Lily is not going to be used as a weapon against me for doing this." "That is why we need to move her before anything else happens," I said. "Before we do anything, before we go to Cheyenne, before any of this becomes visible to Dryden. Lily comes out first." "Dryden's doctor watches her," Feeney said. "He reports to Dryden's man in town every day." "You are still the marshal," I said. "You have authority over medical decisions for your child. A federal marshal has the legal standing to request a transfer of care. Dryden will know immediately. Then we move fast after. But Lily comes out first. That is not a negotiating point." He looked at me for a long moment. Something in his face worked through a sequence of decisions I could not entirely follow. Then he reached inside his coat and brought out a folded document, thick papers folded together. He set it on the bench beside him. "I kept this for 3 years," he said. "Dryden knows I have it. It is the reason he has not moved against me directly. It is a copy of the order he gave me regarding Victor Voss in his own handwriting, and a copy of the original contract he used to coerce the first 2 county officials into the scheme." He paused. "If I give this to you, I lose the only thing that has been keeping Lily safe." "If we get Lily safe first," Clara said from the wall, "you will not need it anymore." Feeney looked at her. He had not heard her speak before. He looked at her, and something in his expression rearranged itself as though her presence had answered a question he had not known he was asking. "You are Victor's daughter," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw moved slightly, the involuntary movement of someone who is working to keep their face steady. "I knew your father," he said. "Not well, but I knew him. He came to me once before he was killed, and he asked me to look at something, a property document, something that he thought was irregular. I told him I did not have jurisdiction over property matters." He stopped. "I had jurisdiction. I had clear jurisdiction. I told him I did not because I was afraid of what looking at it would start." Clara held his gaze. She did not say anything. "I have thought about that conversation a great deal," Feeney said, "in the 3 years since he died." The relay station was very quiet. Outside, the wind pushed at the door without opening it. "You are here now," I said, not as absolution, just as a statement of what was true. He picked up the documents and held them for a moment. Then he set them on the table in front of me. "Tell me exactly what you need me to do," he said. We talked for an hour. The plan took its final shape in that relay station in the flat gray light of a winter afternoon. 4 people with misaligned histories and intersecting needs working out the logistics of something that could not be done perfectly, but had to be done well enough. Feeney would go back to town and wait 3 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, he would use his authority as marshal to formally request that Lily be released into the care of a family member for recovery outside of town. He had an aunt in Sweetwater, a legitimate address with a legitimate relative. Dryden's doctor could not legally block a family transfer unless he manufactured a medical emergency, and manufacturing a medical emergency left a paper trail that a federal investigation would find immediately. Once Lily was on the road to Sweetwater, Patrick Callaway, Jude's father, would be waiting at the crossroads 3 miles east. He would take Lily the rest of the way, a credible arrangement since Patrick was known in the area and drew no attention. Lily would be out of Dryden's reach before Dryden understood what was happening. On the same day Lily was moved, we would leave for Cheyenne. Feeney would ride separately from town, meeting us at the eastern waypoint past Ridgecroft, where the old stock road bent north. Traveling together from that point, he was no longer a marshal on patrol. He was a witness in transit, which was precisely what he was. 3 days, Feeney said, standing to leave. 3 days, I said. He put on his hat. He looked at Clara one more time, the look of a man trying to say something he does not have adequate words for. "He was a good man," he said. "Your father. What he tried to do took more courage than anything I have managed." He paused. "That is worth very little, I know, but it is true." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Courage is not something you either have or you do not," she said. "It is something you use when you can, and when you cannot, you try again later." She held his gaze. "You are here." Something in Feeney's face shifted in a way that was difficult to look at directly. He nodded once briefly and went out. I watched him ride south until he was out of sight. Then I stood in the doorway of the old relay station and looked at the sky, which was beginning to show the early colors of dusk in the west pinks and golds pressing up against the blue from below. 3 days. We went back up the mountain. That night, after Jude had gone to sleep in his bedroll and the cabin had settled into its familiar nighttime sounds, Clara was still sitting at the table with the notebook and her notes. I was in my chair and the fire was low, and the quality of the silence was different from most evenings weighted with the specific gravity of things that have been set in motion. She looked up from the papers and found me looking at the fire. "Elias," she said. I looked at her. "When this is over," she said, "and things have settled, and Crane has done what he is going to do, what will you do?" It was a question I had not asked myself, not in any concrete way. The past 6 years had not required thinking about after, because there had been no reason to expect an after that looked different from the present. "I do not know yet," I said honestly. She looked at me for a moment, the same measuring look I had come to know, the one that checked whether something was true or whether it was being said to manage her. "My father's land in the Powder River Valley," she said, 400 acres. It was returned to us provisionally after his death pending legal resolution. If the resolution goes the way we need it to go, it is mine, free and clear. I waited. "I do not know how to run a ranch," she said. "I know how to investigate things and how to organize information and how to make a case. I do not know how to manage land or stock or the 100 practical things that land requires." "You could hire people who know how to do those things." "I could," she said. "Or I could ask someone who already knows the territory and has no particular place he is planning to be." The fire made a small sound, a log settling. I looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at me with the straightforward directness that I had over the past several weeks come to understand was simply how she looked at things she considered important. "We should get to Cheyenne first," I said. "Yes," she said. "We should." She went back to her notes. I went back to the fire. But the question had been asked, and it was in the room now, quiet and waiting. The way the important things tend to wait, in no particular hurry, confident they will eventually be answered. The question had been asked, and it was in the room now, quiet and patient. The important things tend to wait that way. They do not hurry. They know they will be answered eventually. I looked at the fire until the log burned down to coals, and then I went to sleep. We left before dawn on the third day, not because we were running, because the hour before first light is the quietest hour in mountain country, the hour when the animals have settled and the wind has not yet decided what it wants to do, and the snow holds the silence like a bowl holds water. It is the hour when a group of riders can cover ground without being the most interesting thing in the landscape. I had spent 6 years learning the rhythms of this mountain, and one of the things I had learned was that the mountain is most willing to let you pass unnoticed when it is still half asleep. Jude had gone down 2 days earlier to arrange what needed to be arranged with his father. Patrick Callaway was a man I had not met, but Jude had described him in the way people describe someone they know so completely that description becomes inadequate. A few spare details, and then a shrug, as though the fullness of a person cannot really be transmitted in words. "He is stubborn," Jude had said. "He does not complain. He will be where he is supposed to be." Clara packed the satchel herself carefully, the notebook in the center wrapped in oilcloth, the documents Feeney had given us folded against it, her own notes tucked in beside them. She packed it with the care of someone who understood the weight of what was inside and understand the weight of. She did not rush. She did not check and recheck it the way anxious people do. She packed it once correctly and buckled it closed. I saddled my horse and the spare mare I had kept through the winter for exactly this kind of necessity, a steady, broad-backed dun that did not spook easily and moved sure-footed on uncertain ground. I checked both animals carefully in the lantern light of the lean-to feet and shoes and the condition of the tack. 6 years on a mountain teaches you that the details you check before you leave are the details that determine whether you arrive. We came down through the trees on the north-facing slope first, then cut south along the ridge that ran parallel to the main trail, but sat 100 feet above it, and offered a clear view of the approach from the valley below. The morning was still and very cold, the sky just beginning to shift from black to the deep blue that precedes light. The snow was firm enough to hold the horses without much noise, which was what I had been counting on. Clara rode the dun without difficulty. She had not ridden extensively in the weeks on the mountain, but she had ridden before, and her body remembered it. She kept her weight centered and her hands quiet, and she watched the ground ahead with the same focused attention she brought to everything. We did not talk much that first morning. There was not much to say that had not already been said, and what words there were between us by that point had mostly moved into the category of things that did not require speaking. I would raise my hand and she would stop. I would tilt my head toward a line of trees and she would read the angle and understand it. The shorthand of people who have spent weeks in close quarters attending to the same concerns. By mid-morning we had reached the lower timber, and I turned us east along a drainage that Jude had marked on a rough map drawn from memory, a livestock path used by the smaller ranches in the basin before Dryden had bought them out or bullied them off. It was not a road, it was barely a trail, but it bypassed the 2 main approaches to the valley floor where Dryden's people were most likely to be watching, and it came out on the eastern flank of the basin where the country opened up into broken rolling terrain that offered cover and options. I thought about Feeney as we rode, about what he was doing at that exact moment, which by my calculation was the process of formally requesting Lily's transfer of care standing in whatever room Dryden's doctor used as an office, and exercising the legal authority that he had spent 3 years prostituting in the service of a man who had now turned it against his own child. There was something fitting about it and something terrible about it simultaneously, and I did not try to resolve the 2 feelings into a single clean one, because that was not what they were. Clara had said that courage was not something you either had or did not have, that you used it when you could, and when you could not, you tried again later. I had been turning that over since she said it, not because it was a new idea, but because of who had said it, and in what context, and with what evident belief in its truth. She was not a person who said things she did not mean. That was something I had established early, and had not found any reason to revise. I wondered if my filing of Victor Voss's report 6 years ago had been courage or its absence. I had filed it and it had done nothing, and I had run. The filing was the right thing and the running was the wrong thing, and for 6 years I had arranged those two facts in my mind so that the running was mostly in the foreground, because the running was what I had lived with every day, while the filing had disappeared into the machinery of an institution that had processed it into nothing. But sitting with it honestly, the way Victor Voss had sat with his own history, honestly enough to write the last page of his notebook, I thought that the filing had also been something. Small and insufficient and ultimately ineffective, but something. I thought I was probably not as simple as I had made myself in 6 years of solitude. Most people are not. We stopped at midday in a protected draw where a cluster of aspens cut the wind and a trickle of water still ran under a skin of ice along the lowest point of the ground. I let the horses drink from the open seam in the ice, and we ate standing up dried meat and hard bread from my pack, neither of us making conversation about it. Then Clara said quietly, looking at the horses rather than at me, "What do you think Dryden will do when he realizes what is happening?" "He will try to recover the notebook," I said. "That is the only thing he cannot afford to have reach a federal judge. Everything else, the land fraud, the county officials, the contracts, he has been careful enough that he might have argued his way around some of it, but the notebook has his own people naming him directly in language he cannot reframe. He knows that. He has known it since Victor started keeping it. So he will send people after us. He will send someone. Whether it is many or few depends on how quickly he understands what is happening and how much he wants it contained quietly versus how much he is willing to be visible about it." I looked at the tree line to the south. "His instinct will be quiet. He has gotten this far by being quiet." "Jude's father," she said. "Patrick. What happens if Dryden's people get to him before Lily does?" "Patrick knows how to handle himself," I said, "and Dryden does not know yet that Patrick is involved. Jude has been careful about what he has let be visible." She nodded. The horses finished drinking and stood in the aspen shade, patient and warm-breathed. "You trust Jude?" she said, not a question. "I trust the version of him I knew," I said. "The 6 years between then and now are years I have to take on faith. But the man who came up that mountain the way he came up it, the things he said and how he said them, that is consistent with the man I knew. People change. But the deep structure of a person, what they are made of underneath everything that has happened to them, that tends to hold." She looked at me then, and I had the sense that the observation was not only about Jude. We rode on. The burn of Jude's father's crib was visible from 2 miles out, not the fire itself, which was long past. The darkness of it, the way the charred timber stood against the snow in stark angular lines where the natural landscape had only curves. I saw it before Clara did, and I registered it, and I did not say anything for a moment while I assessed the approach. No movement visible. No horses at the rail. No smoke from the main house chimney, which could mean the house was empty, or could mean a cold fire had been laid very carefully by someone who did not want to be noticed from a distance. Then I saw Patrick Callaway sitting on the bench in front of the main house, a blanket across his knees, looking out at nothing in particular with the patient expression of a man who has been waiting and has accepted that waiting is what is required. He looked up when we came into the yard, and he watched us come without standing, which I understood when we got closer, and I saw that he was older than I had imagined from Jude's description, or perhaps that the fire and what followed it had aged him in the days since. He had a good face, broad and creased with Jude's eyes set in it, the same quality of looking that took its time and did not rush to conclusion. I dismounted, and he looked up at me. "Elias Rourke," he said. "Mr. Callaway, I am sorry about the barn." "It is a barn," he said. "They can burn barns. They cannot burn the land the barn stands on." He looked at Clara, who had dismounted and was standing at her horse's head. "You are Victor's girl." "Clara," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that organized itself around something old and unresolved. "Victor Voss helped my family once," he said. "A property dispute with a neighbor years before any of this started. He looked at the documents and told us exactly what our rights were and did not charge us anything for it. He said it was a simple matter and he was glad to help. He paused. I never forgot it. Simple things that a person does freely are the things people remember. Clara looked at the old man, and for a moment something in her face came very close to the surface. Then she nodded once carefully and looked at the burned barn instead. Lily, I said, has she come through yet? Not yet. Feeney's man said by afternoon. He stood up from the bench slower than he would have 10 years ago, but steadier than a man half his age. Come inside. There is coffee on, and it is warm. We waited 3 hours in the Callaway kitchen, which smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the particular smell of a house that has been kept by the same person for a very long time. Patrick Callaway made coffee and put bread on the table, and did not talk unnecessarily, which I appreciated. Clara sat at the kitchen table and went through her notes one more time, organizing and reorganizing until the organization was as good as it was going to get. The girl arrived at 2:30. She came in a neighbor's wagon driven by a woman who introduced herself only as a friend of Feeney's aunt, a woman of late middle age with a competent expression and no particular interest in explaining herself further. In the bed of the wagon, wrapped in blankets, was Lily Feeney. She was small for her age. The illness had kept her from growing the way a healthy child grows, and her face was thin and pale with the particular pallor of someone who has spent too much of their life indoors. But her eyes were sharp and direct, her father's eyes in miniature, and she looked at the unfamiliar kitchen and the unfamiliar people with attention rather than fear. Patrick Callaway crouched down in front of her with the careful ease of a man who knows how to talk to children. "My name is Patrick," he said. "You can call me that. Are you hungry?" She looked at him. "A little," she said. "Good. I made bread this morning, and it is better with someone to eat it." He stood and went to the kitchen, and Lily watched him go, and then she looked at Clara, who was the closest to her age of anyone in the room. "Are you the one my father is trying to help?" Lily asked. Clara looked at her. "Your father is helping a lot of people," she said, "including me, yes." Lily considered this with the gravity of a child who has learned to take things seriously. Then she went into the kitchen to find the bread. We left within the hour. Lily was settled and Patrick was settled, and the woman in the wagon had agreed to remain through the night, which gave us the buffer we needed. The plan from here was straightforward in design, which did not mean it would be simple in execution. Jude was waiting for us at the junction of the Eastern Stock Road and the main Cheyenne Trail, exactly where he had said he would be sitting on his horse in the late afternoon light, with the patience of a man who has learned to wait without wasting himself in the waiting. He looked at us when we rode up, read our faces, and said, "Lily is out." "Lily is out," I said. Something in him settled, some carried weight redistributing itself. "Good," he said. "Then let us go." We rode until dark and made camp in a shallow ravine where the walls cut the wind and a tongue of rock overhung enough to break the skyline for anyone looking from above. We kept the fire small and fed it dry wood that gave heat without much smoke. The four of us, because Feeney had joined us at the second waypoint east of Ridgecroft as planned, ate and said little. Feeney sat slightly apart from the rest of us. Not from hostility. From the particular solitude of a man who is in the process of becoming someone different than he has been and has not yet worked out the grammar of the new version. He ate his food, and he looked at the fire, and once briefly he looked at Clara with the expression that had been on his face in the relay station, the expression of something old and unresolved that did not have adequate language. Clara met his eyes once. She did not look away, and she did not look toward him with any kind of anger. She simply acknowledged him the way you acknowledge someone who is present and doing something difficult and does not require commentary on it. I watched this without appearing to watch it, which is a skill that investigative work builds and that mountain living keeps sharp. Jude took first watch. I slept for 4 hours and then took the second, and the night passed without incident, which in my experience is never something to take for granted. An uneventful night is a gift. You accept it, and you do not apologize for being grateful. We were moving again before dawn. It was on the second day in the early afternoon that they found us. I heard them before I saw them. Not voices, not the obvious sounds. The specific quality of silence that falls in a canyon when the birds stop moving and the small animals go still, the silence that has shape and weight to it, the silence that is something rather than nothing. I had spent 6 years listening to the Absaroka Range make that silence when predators moved through it, and my body knew what it meant before my mind had finished the thought. I raised my hand. We stopped. The canyon we were moving through was not my first choice of route. Jude had selected it for its directness, and directness had merit with Dryden's people potentially behind us. But canyons are what they are. High walls, limited exits, a fine place to move through quickly, and a very poor place to be caught. I turned in my saddle and looked at the walls above us. Sandstone orange-red in the afternoon light, carved by water into shelves and notches. The kind of terrain that a man with a rifle could use to significant advantage over men on horseback in the open below. To my left, Jude had also stopped and was reading the same silence. "High on the south wall," he said very quietly. "And the north," I said. "At least 2 positions." Clara had her horse still without being told. Feeney was looking at the walls with the expression of a man recalculating. 5 riders came around the bend ahead of us, walking their horses at a pace that said they had been told to hold position until we were properly in the channel. They were Dryden's people. I did not recognize any of them individually, but I recognized the type hired men with the specific posture of people being paid to solve a problem with finality. The man in front raised his hand in a gesture that was not a greeting. "Rourke," he called, "and the Voss woman. Mr. Dryden wants the satchel. Hand it over, and we have no argument with the rest of you." I looked at the riders, 5 in front, at least 2 positions above which meant rifles we could not see from where we stood. The walls of the canyon running 30 feet up on either side with no purchase for a horse and very little for a man. "Jude," I said quietly. "I see it," he said. He had already identified the thing I was counting on, the reason this position was not as closed as it appeared. The south wall had a shelf about 15 feet up running maybe 40 yards accessible from a crack in the rock face just behind and to the left of where we stood. It was a hard scramble and it would be visible for about 10 seconds in the doing, but it put a man above one of the rifle positions and behind the other. "The crack," I said. "Give me 2 minutes," he said. He dismounted and handed me his reins and moved with unhurried deliberateness toward the wall, not running, not appearing to hurry, the way a man moves when he wants the people watching him to take a moment to understand what they are seeing before they decide what to do about it. The man in front called out again. "I am not asking twice." "You have not finished asking once," I called back. "A question requires an answer. The answer takes a moment." Feeney moved his horse alongside mine. He was looking at the riders, not at me, when he said quietly, "There are 2 on the north wall. I can see the barrel of one from here. The second is about 10 yards east of the first. I need you to hold your position and not draw unless someone draws first," I said. "You are still a federal marshal. That matters." "I am a federal marshal who is about to watch a standoff in a canyon for reasons directly related to crimes I participated in." "Yes," I said. "You are still a marshal. That matters more, not less." He was quiet for a moment. Then he straightened in the saddle. Clara moved her horse up to my right. She had the Winchester I had given her before we left the mountain, and she held it across her saddle with the practiced ease of the past weeks of training. "The man on the left," she said not loudly. "He keeps looking up at the south wall." She was right. The man on the far left of the 5 was doing exactly that, the small repeated check of someone who is waiting for a signal from above and is watching for it, which told me that Jude's position on the shelf was either visible from where that man sat or was about to become visible. "Give Jude 10 more seconds," I said. The lead rider's patience ran out first. He reached for his rifle in the scabbard, a deliberate show of force motion rather than an immediate shooting motion, the kind of gesture designed to make a point. In a negotiation it might have worked. In a canyon with loaded weapons on both sides, it was a mistake because it moved the situation from the category of standoff into the category of engagement. And once that line moves, it tends to move fast. Jude's rifle spoke from the shelf above. "Not at a man." At the rock face 6 inches to the left of the north wall rifle position, a flat crack of sound that sent rock chips into the air and made the man behind that position scramble backward with a shout. It was a precise shot, precisely placed, and it said everything that needed saying about what Jude Callaway could do from an elevated position with a clear sightline. The 5 riders in front of us had the problem that tends to afflict people in the middle of the ground when rifle fire comes from above. They did not know immediately where it had come from or where the next one would go, and that uncertainty is its own kind of paralysis. I used the paralysis. "Federal Marshal," I said clearly, loudly enough to carry to the walls. "Colt Feeney, United States Marshal, Sweetwater County. This party is under federal escort. Interference with a federal officer in the conduct of his duties is a hanging offense. I suggest everyone take a moment to think about where they want to be standing when the paperwork on this is written up." It was a blunt instrument. It would not have worked in a town where people knew the context, where the tangle of what Feeney was and what he was not would have been visible. Out here in a canyon in open country with a badge on his chest and a rifle shot still ringing in the stone walls, it landed differently. The lead rider looked at Feeney. He looked at the walls. He looked at me. Then he looked at this man to his left, who looked at the man to his right, and in that triangulation of looks was the entire content of a decision being made by committee. The lead rider turned his horse, not fast, not panicked. The deliberate saving-face withdrawal of men who have decided that the specific $1,000 on offer is not worth the specific collection of circumstances they are currently in. They went back around the bend, their horses walking, and the sound of them diminished and was gone. The second rifle position on the north wall held for another 30 seconds. Then I heard the man move the scrape of boots on stone, retreating. Clara lowered the Winchester. Her hands were steady. "You did not fire," I said. "There was no shot I needed to take," she said. "You told me not to fire unless I needed to. I did not need to." I looked at her. "You taught me well," she said without particular emphasis, as though it were simply a fact being registered. Jude came down from the shelf, dusting his hands on his coat, and retrieved his horse from me. He swung up and looked at the bend where the riders had gone. "They will report back," he said, "and then there will be more. By the time there are more," Feeney said, "we will be in Cheyenne." We rode hard for the rest of that day and well into the night, changing the angle of our approach twice on my direction, using the old freight routes that existed in this part of Wyoming before the main roads were established and that appeared on no current map I was aware of. The sky was clear and the moon was enough to ride by, and we rode. Cheyenne came into view the following afternoon, spread across the basin floor in the flat winter light smoke rising from 100 chimneys into the cold, dry air. From a distance it looked organized, solid, the kind of place where things were decided and recorded and filed and acted upon. The kind of place that was at its best, what it represented itself to be. I had not seen it in 6 years. It looked more or less as I remembered it, which was both a comfort and a statement about the persistence of places through the changes of the people in them. We went to the federal courthouse on Capitol Avenue, not through the main entrance, which fronted on the main street and was visible from most of the surrounding block, but through the side entrance on the quieter cross street. Feeney knew the building. He led us through the side door and down a corridor that smelled of old paper and lamp oil and the accumulated weight of old paper and official business, and to the outer office of the Honorable Arthur Crane, United States District Judge appointed 4 months ago from a court in the Eastern District. A man who had arrived in Wyoming Territory with no existing relationships, no accumulated obligations, and no reason yet to look away from anything. The clerk in the outer office was a young man with ink-stained cuffs, who looked up at us with the expression of someone who has learned to assess the urgency of arrivals quickly and efficiently. Feeney showed his badge. "Federal matter," he said, "requiring the judge's attention today. Not tomorrow. Today." The clerk looked at the badge. He looked at the rest of us, taking in the trail-worn condition of our clothing and the general impression of people who had come from somewhere difficult in some haste. He stood up. "I will see if the judge is available," he said. He was available. Arthur Crane was a compact man in his late 50s with the kind of face that legal work makes when it is done seriously over a long period of time. Clear-eyed, economical in expression, the face of someone who has learned to evaluate the weight of evidence without letting it show on their features while the evaluation is in progress. He looked at the four of us when we came into his office, and he did not look alarmed or impatient. He looked interested. "Sit down," he said, "all of you." We sat. Clara put the satchel on her lap. Feeney was at the end of the row, his hat on his knee. Crane looked at Clara. "You are Victor Voss's daughter," he said. The second time someone had said that to her, and the second time it landed differently than the same statement would have landed from a stranger. "Yes," she said. "You know who my father was?" Crane opened the center drawer of his desk and took out a letter, thick paper, folded and sealed, the seal broken. "Your father wrote to me," he said, "in November of last year." He described in general terms the situation he had been documenting and the risk he believed himself to be in. "He asked me if anyone came to me with evidence to be prepared to hear it." He set the letter on the desk in front of him. "I received it in December, 3 weeks after he was killed." Clara looked at the letter. The handwriting visible on the outside fold was her father's. "He prepared for it," she said, not loudly. "He was a careful man," Crane said, "and a brave one." He looked at the satchel. "I would like to see what you have brought me." Clara opened the satchel. She set the notebook on the desk first, then Feeney's documents, then her own organized notes. She set them in order, and she placed her hand flat on the top of the notebook for a moment before lifting it away. Crane read for 40 minutes, not quickly, not the scan of someone covering ground, the careful, thorough reading of someone who knows that what is read in this room will determine the shape of what comes after. Occasionally he made a note. Occasionally he stopped and looked at a specific passage and read it again. No one spoke. Feeney sat at the end of the row and looked at his hands. Once he looked up at the wall behind Crane's desk where there was a framed reproduction of the text of the Constitution, and his jaw worked slightly and then stilled. Jude looked at the window. I looked at the floor and thought about Victor Voss writing a letter to a judge he had never met describing things he knew he might not survive to resolve, trusting that the machinery of the law so thoroughly corrupted at the local level still functioned somewhere at the level he was addressing. Clara sat straight and still and did not look at anything in particular. The set of her face was the set of someone who is holding something very large at bay through the pure application of will, and who has been doing this long enough that it has become a kind of skill. When Crane finished, he set the last page down. He looked at Feeney. "You are named in these documents Marshal," he said. "Yes, sir," Feeney said. "I am here to address that directly." He paused. "I am prepared to provide a full accounting of my involvement, my testimony as a material witness, and my formal cooperation with whatever investigation this court sees fit to conduct. I am also prepared to accept the legal consequences of my actions." Crane looked at him for a long moment with the measuring quality that was apparently simply how he looked at everything. "Your cooperation is noted," he said, "and will be taken into account." He looked back at the documents. The land fraud contracts, the coercion of the county officials, the order regarding Victor Voss. He tapped the last of Feeney's papers. "This in particular, this is in Dryden's own hand." "It is," Feeney said. "And you have been in possession of it for 3 years." "Yes, sir." "Using it as personal security against direct action by Dryden against yourself." "Yes, sir." Crane absorbed this. "A risk-averse man would have destroyed it," he said. "You kept it." Feeney was quiet for a moment. "I kept it," he said, "because some part of me knew I was going to need it for this eventually. I told myself it was for protection. But I think the other thing was also true." Crane looked at him for another moment. Then he turned to his clerk who was standing at the door. "I need you to bring me the forms for an emergency asset freeze," he said, "and send a message to Deputy Marshal Hendricks that I need him here within the hour." He looked at us. "The asset freeze I can execute today. It removes Dryden's financial capacity to act and signals to every official who has been operating under his protection that the protection is no longer operative." He paused. The formal arrest warrant will take longer. Procedurally, a minimum of 2 weeks for the full documentation to be processed and reviewed. But the freeze will accomplish the most urgent thing immediately. He will know, I said. He will know, Crane agreed. And he will likely attempt to move resources he believes are beyond the freeze. We will be watching for that. It is in fact useful for us if he tries. He looked at Clara. Your father's notebook is the central document in this case. It will need to remain with this court. It stays, Clara said without hesitation. It was always going to stay. Crane nodded. He looked at all of us, taking the full measure of the group. You came a considerable distance under considerable difficulty to bring this here, he said. I want to be direct with you about what comes next because people in your situation deserve directness rather than comfort. He folded his hands on the desk. Dryden will be brought to account. The evidence is sufficient and the structure of this case is sound. The process will take time and it will not be simple, and there will be moments when it appears to be moving too slowly. But it will move, and it will conclude where the evidence leads it to conclude. He looked at Clara specifically when he said the next thing. Your father's notebook will be entered into the record with his name on it as the primary investigator of this matter. Whatever the rest of the proceedings reveal about anyone involved, that attribution will stand. Victor Voss compiled this evidence. Victor Voss sent me the letter that prepared me to receive it. Victor Voss is the reason this case exists. He paused. That will not be lost. Clara looked at him. The thing that had been held at bay all day moved in her face briefly and completely, and then she brought it back under control with the quiet, practiced strength that I had come to understand was simply how she was made. Thank you, she said. Her voice was even. That is what I needed to hear. Crane stood. We stood. He came around the desk and shook hands with each of us, the formal handshake of a proceeding being put in motion, each clasp a kind of signature. When he reached Feeney, he held the handshake for a moment. Go home to your daughter, Marshall, he said, and then come back here in 2 weeks with your written accounting. We will handle the rest from there. Feeney straightened. Yes, sir, he said. We came out of the courthouse into the late afternoon of Cheyenne, the cold air sharp after the closed warmth inside the street, moving with the ordinary traffic of an ordinary day that had no idea what had just occurred inside that building. Jude stood beside me on the steps and looked out at the street and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, That is done then. The beginning of it is done, I said. The rest will take time. But it is moving. It is moving. He nodded. He looked at the street a moment longer. Then he turned and went down the steps toward the horses. Feeney shook my hand without words and did the same. He had a long ride to Sweetwater and a daughter waiting, and 2 weeks before he had to come back to Cheyenne and put his own accounting in writing. He rode out of the yard and turned north and did not look back, which I understood. Clara and I stood on the steps a moment longer. I should say what it was like to stand there because it was not what you might expect from a moment at the end of something long and difficult. It was quiet. The resolution of large things tends to be quieter than the anticipation of them. There is the big noise of the struggle, and then there is the smaller sound of the actual conclusion, and the smaller sound is often startling in its understatement. I was aware that the wanted notice bearing my name was at this moment technically still valid. That would take time to formally resolve the paperwork moving through its required steps. But Crane knew the situation, and the deputy marshal inside that building knew it, and the practical reality of it had already changed, even if the paper had not caught up yet. 6 years I had been on a mountain with a warrant over my head and the name of the man responsible for Ruth's death in my chest, like something swallowed wrong. The warrant was functionally dissolved. The man responsible was looking at a federal case that would not be stopped by money or local influence or any of the instruments he had used for years to redirect the machinery of justice away from himself. It was not the same as Ruth being alive. Nothing was the same as that. But it was the nearest thing to resolution that the real world offers, which is not transformation, but realignment. Things moved to where they should have been. Accounts brought to where they should balance. I looked at the street. I thought about the mountain. I thought about the cabin I had built there 6 years ago with the understanding never quite spoken to myself that I was building something permanent, that the mountain was where I lived now and where I would continue to live until the mountain was done with me. I was not sure that was true anymore. Clara came down 2 steps, so she was standing slightly below me, and she turned and looked up at me with the evening light on her face and the cold bringing color into her cheeks. She was not smiling exactly, something more specific than a smile, the expression of a person who has done what they came to do and is now in the unfamiliar territory of whatever comes after. "You are thinking about going back up," she said. "I am thinking about a number of things," I said. "The cabin." "The cabin, yes." She looked at me for a moment with that measuring quality. "You do not have to," she said. "Go back up, I mean. There is not a rule that says the place where you hid becomes the place you have to stay." "I know that." "Do you?" I thought about it honestly. "I am working on knowing it," I said. She turned back to the street. "Powder River Valley," she said, not for the first time. 3 days from here if the roads are clear." She paused. "Jude said his father might come in the spring, help with the first season. He said Patrick has opinions about fence lines and he wanted to share them with someone. Patrick Callaway shares his opinions whether he is invited to or not, from what Jude tells me." "Then he will fit in well," she said. "I have opinions about fence lines too." I came down the steps and we stood on the same level. The street moved around us with its ordinary afternoon business. Somewhere down the block a blacksmith was working the rhythmic ring of metal on metal coming clean through the cold air. I reached into the breast pocket of my coat. I took out the small tin flask that I had carried for 6 years, the one that Ruth had used to hold dried flowers, and that had been empty since before I came to the mountain, its contents turned to dust and lost so long ago that I had stopped thinking of it as a container for something, and had started thinking of it simply as the weight of her in my pocket, the small daily reminder that she had existed and had been taken. I held it for a moment. Then I looked at Clara, and I held it out. She looked at it. She took it. She turned it over in her hand, understanding without being told what it was and what it meant. She looked up at me. She did not ask if I was certain. She was not that kind of person. She put it in the pocket of her coat against her side. "Powder River," I said. 3 days, she said. She went down to where the horses were tied and began loosening her mare's reins from the post, and I followed, and we found Jude where he had gone to water the horses at the trough at the end of the block, and the 3 of us went together out of Cheyenne in the late afternoon, turning east and then north as the light went gold and the cold came down, riding toward a valley neither Clara nor I had ever seen, but that had been waiting for us in its particular way, as places wait for the people who are going to make them into something. The mountain was still up there in the northwest gray-white against the darkening sky, its peaks catching the last of the sun. I looked at it once. 6 years of mornings on that rock, 6 years of solitude and cold, and the daily maintenance of being alive, and underneath all of it, the slow, reluctant work of a man deciding whether to continue living in the fullest sense of that word or only in the biological one. I had made my decision. I was not entirely sure when. Possibly it was when I came back on the 3rd day and lifted Clara Voss from the snow. Possibly it was earlier in some movement below the level of what I had admitted to myself. It did not matter when. It mattered that it was made. I turned north with the others, and I did not look back again. Epilogue. First summer. Powder River Valley. The house was not finished by summer. That was all right. The walls were up and the roof held, and the windows faced east to catch the morning light the way Clara had insisted on, over my stated preference for a southern orientation that I had argued for with more persistence than the argument deserved, and had ultimately abandoned, which Jude found funnier than necessary and mentioned more often than required. Patrick Callaway arrived in April with a wagon full of opinions about fence lines, and a cured ham and a seedling apple tree wrapped in burlap that he had carried from Sweetwater, with a care that suggested it was more important than anything else in the wagon, which it probably was. He planted it on the south side of the house in a spot he selected himself, walking the ground in a slow circle 3 times before deciding. And when Clara asked him why that particular spot, He said it was where the light would be right in 20 years when the tree was producing properly, and when Clara said she supposed they would find out. He looked at her with the patient expression of someone who has been growing things for a long time and said that was the point of planting a tree, to find out. Lily Feeney came with her father in May. She was healthier than she had been in the canyon relay station, the color better in her face, the cough mostly gone. She walked the perimeter of the unfinished house with the thorough inspection of a child cataloging a new place, and she found the spring that ran along the eastern edge of the property and reported it to Clara as though it were a discovery, which it was in its way, since neither of us had found it yet. Feeney had completed his accounting with Judge Crane's court in March. The sentencing had been what Crane had indicated. It would be 18 months reduced for full cooperation and time already served in administrative suspension. He was free by summer. He was not a marshal anymore. He was a man who had been a marshal, which is a different thing, and he was working out what came next in the careful, deliberate way of a person who does not trust themselves to hurry. He sat on the unfinished porch the afternoon of their visit and watched Lily at the spring and said very little. Once he said quietly to no one in particular that he had not expected the valley to be this green, and I said that the spring runoff filled the water table and the grass came fast and heavy here in the first weeks of the season, and he nodded and kept watching Lily. That was the full extent of the conversation. It was enough. Dryden's trial concluded in September. I was not there for it, and Clara was not there for it. We received word through Crane's clerk, a letter that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when I was on the roof fixing a section of cedar shingles that had lifted in a windstorm, and Clara was below in the house doing something with the accounts. She brought the letter out and read it standing in the yard while I came down from the roof. Harlan Dryden had been convicted on 12 counts of fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and 1 count of corrupting a federal official. The sentence was 22 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. He was 61 years old. 22 years was barring the unexpected, a life sentence dressed in a specific number. The lands and assets seized under the fraud convictions were in the process of being returned to their legitimate owners. The county officials who had accepted Dryden's money and direction were variously charged, fined, removed from office, or in 2 cases also imprisoned, depending on the degree of their involvement. The territorial political structure was, as Crane's letter diplomatically described it, undergoing significant reorganization. Clara folded the letter when she finished it. She stood in the yard for a moment looking at the mountains to the west, which were visible from the valley floor as a blue-gray line against the sky. Then she looked at me. "That is done," she said. "That is done," I said. She handed me the letter and went back inside. I heard her resume whatever she had been doing with the accounts, the sound of it carrying through the open window, ordinary and steady. I stood in the yard with the letter and looked at the mountains for a while. Somewhere up in the Absaroka, the cabin I had built stood empty. I had left it intact. Not from sentimentality, or not only from that, because winter in those mountains is a serious matter, and an empty cabin in the right place at the right time is the difference between a man caught out surviving and not surviving, and I had lived long enough in that country to understand that you do not remove resources from the landscape without a reason. Patrick Callaway had suggested in his direct way that the cabin might make a useful base for summer grazing in the high pastures if we ever expanded the herd to the point of needing high pastures. I had told him that was a reasonable thought. He had told me that most of his thoughts were reasonable and that I would get used to hearing them. I folded Crane's letter and put it in my breast pocket and went to find the tools for the second section of roofing. Jude came by in October on his way south to winter work in New Mexico. He stayed 2 nights and we talked the way people talk who have been through something together and do not need to reference it directly to have it present in the room. He played cards with Clara, and she beat him twice, and he accused her of cheating with the specific good humor of someone who knows they are not being cheated, but prefers the explanation. On the morning he left, he stood at his horse and looked at the house and the yard and the fence lines running out toward the eastern pasture. "It looks like a place," he said. "It is a place," I said. "I mean, it looks like a place that will be here in 30 years. He swung up. "That is different from just being a place." He rode south, and I watched him go, and then I went back to what I had been doing. The evenings that fall were something I did not have language for, and did not try particularly hard to find language for, because some things are better held than described. The work of the day done, the fire lit, the sound of the valley coming in through the windows. Clara at the table with her reading or her writing, the lamp burning yellow in the room. The weight of the day settling. The particular silence of two people who are comfortable enough with each other that silence has become a thing they can share, rather than a thing that requires filling. Once near the end of October, when the first cold had come down from the north and the mountains were white above the timberline, Clara found the tin flask in her coat pocket while she was looking for something else. She had apparently forgotten it was there. She set it on the table. She looked at it. She looked at me. She did not say anything. She went to the window and looked out at the yard and the mountains beyond, and I looked at the flask on the table, and we stayed like that for a moment in the lamplight, the fire warm behind us, the cold pressing at the windows from outside. Then she turned from the window and picked up the flask and went to the corner of the room where she kept a handful of things that were hers, specifically set apart from the general order of the house. She put the flask there in that space and left it. I watched her do it. I did not say anything. She came back to the table and picked up her book and found her page. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning, light and early, tapping at the windows with a softness that was nothing like the Absaroka in January, nothing like the weight of what that snow had covered and eventually been forced to reveal. This was a different kind of snow, the kind that falls on a place that has people in it, the kind that is domestic and ordinary and falls on rooftops and fields and fence lines and the bare branches of an apple tree planted in the spot where the light will be right in 20 years. I sat down across from her, and she did not look up from her book, and I did not say anything, and the snow came down outside, and the fire kept its steady business, and the valley held us as it holds everything that arrives and stays, without ceremony, without condition, and decided finally to stay.